Hello everyone, it's Mr. Taylor. I've been reviewing and glancing at some of everyone's drafts for the analysis, and I feel impelled to put a video together to address some common issues that I'm seeing. I just spent an hour recording a video that just got deleted, so unfortunately this is just going to be a synopsis of some of the same things I was trying to provide some assistance for, just is what it is at this point. So what I want to do is talk about some common things that I'm seeing. And what I'm going to do now is pull up a document here. So step one, what should you do when you're writing this draft? Or now, hopefully you should be simply revising it or adding the details. The first thing you want to do is ensure that your document is in the correct overall format. There are formatting samples on Canvas. There are documents out there that you can actively use, but I'm going to walk you through the things you should check. Number one, make sure that your margins are at 1 inch all around. You can do that by going to Layout, Margins, 1, all the way around all sides of the document. Step two, make sure your header text is in the right font, Times New Roman 12-point font. Secondly, make sure that if you have a page number in your header, that it is also the same font. So you will see here that this one is in Calibri, so we're going to change that to Times New Roman 12-point font. All of the font should be consistent. It should be the same thing throughout. One thing I do want to also point out is that the cover page of your document has an implied page 1. So you won't have the actual page number on the cover page. Your page number will pick up with page 2 in your header on your second page. You have to play around with Microsoft Word a little bit in order to get that in the right format. So you have to kind of play with it. Finally, the thing that I'm seeing a lot of people miss is paragraph and line spacing. It's easy to miss because you won't see it unless you have a trained eye for seeing it, but you can, however, make sure it's in the right format. Do this on your cover page text as well as all the following text in your document. Highlight your text, right click, paragraph, look down to spacing. Before should be set to 0, after set to 0, spacing it double, nothing in this box, and make sure don't add space to paragraph, between paragraphs of the same style is checked, and then hit OK. It's very important to also follow that same process with your content text. So highlight all of your content text, right click, paragraph, spacing, follow the same exact items here. This is APA formatting in terms of overall document formatting, and it has to be adhered to completely. You can't halfway do it. It has to be all the way in the right format. It either is or it isn't. So make sure that you're doing these things. Make sure that the text is flush top of your document, which means your text is directly under your header. There's no extra space here. And then that's overall document formatting. Make sure you have a cover page such as this one. You have your content pages, and then you have a references section that will look like this. And so you'll notice it is titled References. It's not a bibliography. It's not works cited. It's none of those other names that other style guides use. In APA, it is References. And so your overall document will look something like this. This is just a draft of a student's document I'm using to show you how to go through and do some of these things. All right. So another thing that I'm noticing is the way by which everyone is referring to the authors. So let me go ahead and clear that up. In your introductory paragraph, you are going to include the full name of each author. You're going to include the full title of each video. And that will be the only time you refer to the title of the video and the author's full name in the paper. So for instance, here you can see I stated Emma Watson. Attributed because we are referring to her, it is referring to a source. So Emma Watson 2014 in her gender inequality address to the United Nations. And also take note that the titles of the video should be italicized rather. Make sure you're following this general format in your introduction. And then you'll notice that every subsequent time that you refer to an author, you're only going to do it by last name. So this is Watson. So it will look something like this. You will not use their full name again, only in the introduction. You won't use the title of the argument again. So this is the way that academic papers are typically written. And so we need to get into the practice of kind of training ourselves to attribute when we start new sections and start new paragraphs. Um, so yeah, the other thing is to make sure when you're starting a new paragraph in your document that you are attributing. If you are referring to a source and you're starting a new paragraph, you have to start out citing immediately. So get in the habit of putting your attribution in your sentences if you're referring to a source when you're starting a new paragraph. So yeah, I'm going to pull up the outline now. Let's do this. So just like I mentioned, your introductory section should include your author's names, full names, and the title of each video. And it should also include some type of context. You don't want to start your entire analysis with a thesis statement. You want to provide some type of supporting detail to lead into your thesis statement. So your thesis statement should be towards the end of your introductory section. So I put a very rough draft version of what I would expect an introduction to look like here in front of you. So the best way to do this would be to kind of fuse all the elements you need in your introduction into one sentence that covers all the bases, right? So in this introduction, I state Emma Watson, 2014, and her gender inequality address to the United Nations, and Christina Hoff Summers, 2017, and her There Is No Gender Wage Gap informational YouTube video. Both present oppositional perspectives to the idea of gender inequality. However, the rhetorical situations of each argument are different. As such, the rhetorical strategies are imperative in determining which argument is most effective based on its rhetorical situation. Then you have your thesis statement. You can use the one I've provided verbatim, it doesn't matter. This analysis will evaluate the rhetorical techniques the authors utilized when appealing to ethos, pathos, and logos while focusing on context, audience, and purpose in order to determine which author effectively achieves exigence. And so you'll notice I use the word rhetorical a lot here because that is an academic term. So when we say rhetorical strategies, we are referring to ethos, pathos, and logos. Those are all strategies of rhetoric that people use to persuade or employ in arguments to achieve their purpose. The rhetorical situation, as I stated here, simply what is the argument situation? Where is the argument? That's the context piece, that's the audience piece, that's the purpose piece. So it's just using different words or terminology to refer to those things. So this is what I would expect an effective introduction to this analysis. This is what I would expect it to look like. Very simple. You don't have to hash anything out other than including the details that you're asked to include in the outline. So it is simple as that. The next thing I want to point out is that what follows after your introduction is going to be an analysis of each argument separately. You're not going to be comparing and contrasting or anything like that. You're going to jump right into argument one and you're going to analyze argument one. And so that particular section is going to have four main elements. You're going to have one paragraph or section that I consider to be the building blocks of the argument section. All we need to know is what is the premise? What is the main assumption that the argument is based on? What is the main point of the argument, in other words? And then tell us what is the exact purpose? Who is the audience? And what are some of those contextual factors? That's all we need to know about the argument in itself. You do not have to summarize the argument. In fact, that is the opposite of what you're supposed to be doing. I saw some drafts where people were summarizing the arguments in 2 or 3 pages. None of that is needed. We don't need, that's not what we're analyzing. We're analyzing ethos, pathos, and logos. So all we need to know about the argument itself is the main assumption or the premise, in other words, and the purpose, audience, and context. Then you will go into paragraphs for each appeal. So a paragraph for ethos, pathos, and logos. And these are the sections that you will provide examples. These are the these sections whereby you're addressing each appeal individually. So for ethos, I would expect 2 or 3 examples of appeals to ethos in argument 1. Appeals to pathos, the same, and logos, the same. So this is all contingent upon each argument. They're not going to be balanced the same. One argument may be heavily ethos driven, one may be heavily pathos driven. So the balance of how many examples you include will clearly be contingent upon each argument. However, even if one of these things are minimal in a certain argument, you have to address that. You have to state that outright. So if argument 1, for instance, is heavily pathos driven and there's not much ethos whatsoever in the argument, you would need to state that in its own section. For the 2 arguments we're using, I will argue that there are some of all of these things. I think you have enough material to include about 3 examples for each appeal for both arguments. And then, so building block section, what is the premise, audience, purpose, all of that stuff in its own paragraph, and then separate paragraphs for ethos, pathos, logos. And that's argument 1. Then you will include some transition sentences to show that you're moving from an analysis of argument 1 to argument 2. So we need to have some type of transition or segue piece in there that shows we're moving from that analysis to argument 2 analysis. And then in argument 2, you follow the same exact process. You're not going to compare and contrast any of these things. You're not going to say Watson's appeals to ethos are more effective than Summers. None of that's going to happen. It's as if you are writing a paper on each argument separately first. Now, after you do this for argument 1 and argument 2, then you get that comparing and contrast piece, which is the exigence piece. This is the heart of what the entire analysis is about. But what you're doing is you're utilizing all of the examples and all the information you provide from each argument to then make your own argument about which particular author achieved exigence or used their appeals appropriately to be effective with their argument. So this is where you really hash out the balance piece. Was argument 1 more effective because they strategically balanced or strategically utilized their appeals in such a way to be more pathos driven in order to achieve their purpose? Or vice versa, was the argument balanced so that the appeals were more heavily focused on ethos in order to be more informational in nature? And so this is where you make those statements, and this is where you make the argument for yourself, telling us who achieved their purpose based on their appeals. Finally, at the end, we have your conclusion wherein you must restate your thesis statement in some way, recap everything. This section can be minimal. There's nothing really needed other than wrapping the analysis up. Another note about purpose, I want to point out that purpose is not face value. You have to think outside of the box. The purpose is not to talk about or just informing about gender inequality. It has to go much further than that. So, for instance, argument 1, let's just use Watson, for example, and I will even give you this one. The purpose of Watson's argument is to advocate on behalf of what appears to be a nonprofit organization that is actively working towards gender equality. And so she's addressing the UN and she's advocating on behalf of that particular organization, but she's also advocating for and persuading people to change opinions, beliefs, and attitudes about gender inequality. So all of that would be the purpose, right? It's not just as simple as saying the purpose is to inform about gender inequality. You have to look at the entire situation. And all of those things would be considered purposes. And so that's the level of detail I'm looking for both of the videos. And I'll tell you right now that one of them is much more complex than the other. But you have to think outside of the box in terms of purpose. Now, when you're analyzing each argument and you're looking at the appeals, the way to do this is to look at the readings, the slides from class where there were questions you can ask about ethos, pathos, logos. Ethos, for instance, is not just about providing sources or citing them correctly. It's about tone, it's about presentation, it's about professionalism, it's about credentials and education. And pathos is a lot more involved than just being emotional. It has to do with word choice, language, assumptions that are emotionally loaded based on the audience. So the best way to analyze those pieces would be to look at the slides from class that have ethos, pathos, and logos broken down, and there are several different questions you can ask to determine if each are effective or not. So look back at the class slides to make sure that you're, providing adequate examples of those things. Yep. This is a little bit more complicated in terms of thinking. The writing is pretty prescriptive. In fact, I tell you exactly what to write and how to write it. This analysis is more so looking at, do you follow the outline, but are you also including depth of thought and analysis when you're evaluating the two arguments? Again, there is no right or wrong answer. Your grade is contingent upon all of the elements of the assignment instructions, but also making sure that you are thinking outside of the box. You're thinking contextually, you're looking at all of the details, but you're also looking at a macro level or an overview of each situation. I do want to also point out that I'm seeing people include some of the prohibited words, terminology, contractions, etc. So if you notice on the main Canvas page for our class, if you scroll down under writing resources, you can click there. The prohibited items list is at the very bottom. It will look something like this when you pull it up. You cannot use any of these words, any of these phrases. You cannot use contractions. You must spell words out completely. This is a 100-point assignment. There are 10 points, 10-point deduction each time you use one of these words. So, for instance, if you use me, my, you, if you use 3 of those in your paper, that's 30 points off automatically. And so I'm doing this because I really want to train everyone to start writing academically. And we're also now at that point where we're writing and we're separating ourselves from the writing. Being academic is being objective. In this analysis, you're stepping outside of yourself and the situation to objectively analyze all the elements of the argument. And so there is no room for value judgments. It's not about what you think. It's not about how you personally associate yourself with the content. It's more so presenting the facts, and the facts speak for themselves. So you won't use any pronouns such as me, my, we, you, us, things like that. But also some of the waste words like get, got, gotten, any form of got, just, you, really. Those types of words you can't use. Also, anything that's conversational, don't use. Frankly, at any rate, as a matter of fact, those types of statements do not belong in academic writing at this point. My biggest tip for this is to, everybody has their own writing process, but before you submit this thing, make sure you're not including any of these words. If you don't know how to determine if something is conversational enough or not, highlight your text and have your computer read it back to you. Have your phone read it back to you. Read it out loud. Have someone else read it to you. And if any of these words stick out, eliminate them or change the word. Contractions, you can only get that by reviewing your document thoroughly to make sure you do not have contractions. Don't should be do not. Can't should be cannot. You spell all of those words out. Abbreviations should all be spelled out. So here we have the UN. We want to make sure we're saying United Nations. So make sure all of those things are taken into consideration. What else did I notice? Let me look at my notes here. I think many people are missing attributions. And so the idea is, like I mentioned earlier, after your introduction, you're only going to refer to each author by last name with year and publication. That's attribution format, or text citation format, as you can see here. Again, this is a draft, but I'm going to show you on this document how to fix some of these things, and it may help you when you're putting this draft together. When you start a new paragraph, like I mentioned, you always make your attribution. I think it's safe to say that every 3 sentences or so after you attribute, you'll need to attribute again. So just doing it at the beginning is not good enough. So in this example, you'll see that there are attributions throughout, and that's what you need to be doing. Um, if you are in doubt that you're paraphrasing too much and you need to put an attribution or a citation, err on the side of caution. It is better to provide more attributions and citations in times of doubt than not including it at all. Um, there was a student asking me in class if there's a maximum to how much we can cite, and right now I'm going to say no. The general idea is every 3 sentences, I would expect to see some type of citation. Um, but again, if you're in doubt, a tip is that you can include an in-text citation, and I'm just going to put this here just as an example. At the very end of your paragraph, and technically that citation can encapsulate anything that doesn't have a citation for that paragraph. That does not mean that you can put that there and might not cite the rest of your material. It's just saying it's a catch-all. If you think there's a sentence or two that needs to be cited, but you're not sure, you can put the in-text citation in. The other thing that's important is knowing what to do with your punctuation. And so clearly this is just a draft. Your document should just be text, right? But let's look at an example of what I'm talking about here. So we have a quote and then in-text citation after the quote. Anytime you use a quote, you absolutely 100% must have the attribution or in-text citation. That is a clear plagiarism charge. Furthermore, now that we're working with 2 sources, you can be charged for plagiarism if you don't do this stuff correctly. So just make sure you're referring to APA Purdue OWL or Writer's Reference. Make sure you're including your citations. But here, for example, there are 2 periods. There's one after the sentence, and then there's one at the end of the total sentence, or one in the quote, one after the sentence. Your period is always going to go outside of your citation, like you can see here. That's if you're using an in-text citation. Now, say for instance, you're ending your sentence with just a quote, then your period would go inside your quote marks like this. So those are the 2 general ways that you'll see it happening in your sentences when you're drafting this analysis. Just get into the habit of making sure that your periods are inside your quotation marks, and that if you do have an in-text citation, your period is at the end. So that's just another thing I want to point out that I've noticed. There are exceptions to that with other punctuation marks, but you're not going to see that for the most part in this particular paper. Make sure that your paragraphs are indented, like this one. And then in your references section, I'll point this out. Make sure this is references. Your references will look something like this. Your second line or second and each subsequent line of each reference citation will be indented. Only the first line is all the way flush left. I'm going to leave this up to you guys to determine the correct way to do this, but I'll just point out that if you go to Purdue OWL, let me move some stuff around so I can show you, and you scroll down, you'll see that the guide for APA is broken down into your in-text. So this is how to show how to do the attributions and the in-text citations for 1, 2, 3 authors. Then the rest of the section is how do you handle your reference citations in your references section. So we're clearly using electronic sources. We're using 2 YouTube videos. And so you can scroll down here on this page and you will find it. It'll say YouTube. Here it is. This is the general format, and this is an example. The one thing I will point out is that for last name, first and middle initials, you can just use the last name of each speaker, Watson and Summers. You would just put their last name and then their initials. The rest of this content will be up to you. You have to pull the accurate information and put it in the right format. I think that hits on all of the points for this at 25 minutes now. So I'm going to leave the rest up to you. Make sure that you take these things into consideration. Make sure you clean up, you spell check, you try to do some grammar checking on this document. There is no draft on this one. So the final version of this that you submit is indeed the final, and it's different than the personal essay whereby you'll have a chance to completely revise based on my comments. This one's different. You have to utilize the resources that are available to you. I've taken my time out of my weekend to provide this video for you to show you some of the things that I'm looking for and to set the expectation and the precedent for what I'm looking for. The rest is up to you. Make sure you're using all of the resources. You have a textbook you can look at. You have several, or should have several, where you can see examples of how to write sentences. You can find ways to cite things. You've got APA Purdue OWL. We have the Writing Center on campus who has weekend hours. I want to reiterate that no late submissions of this will be accepted for any reason. So it's due Sunday, tomorrow, the 7th by 11:59. There are computers on campus, so if you're having technological issues for whatever reason, you might want to make sure that you go and you write the paper maybe today on Saturday and submit it instead of running the risk of not having it submitted on time. If it is not submitted, you will lose all credit. It has to be submitted by 11:59. If it hits midnight, the Dropbox will close. I'm not doing email submissions or anything like that on this one. So this one is a big deal. It is 20% of your grade, no draft. So make sure you're taking the time to do this correctly. Make sure you're not throwing it together without thinking about it. I also want to point out that your peers in your class may be a great resource. You might be able to review these analyses together, look at how other people are handling certain situations. So tap into all of those resources. I'm also here. Shoot me an email if you have any questions. And good luck, everybody. I look forward to what you submit.